They said I was a mirror of my mother, sweet, obedient, made to serve. But the truth is, since I was very young, something burned silently inside me. They called it rebellion. My father called it temptation. I called it hunger. Hunger for something I didn't yet know how to name. But that ached every time I heard the church bells and saw my life being stitched together with threads I didn't choose. My name is Merian Grace Holloway, the only daughter of Pastor Elias Holloway. And throughout my childhood, I was taught to be small. Small in my desires, my words, my dreams. I grew up between hymns and confessions, long skirts, and eyes watching my every move. Other girls could laugh loudly and run barefoot when no one was looking. I couldn't. My laughter was restrained, my faith had to be visible, and my heart, well, it belonged to God, or to the man my father would one day choose. For me, it was 1942, and the world outside was crumbling in trenches and bombs. But here, in this forgotten corner of Georgia, I was crumbling in silence. Because everyone spoke of war as if it were distant, but my war was already raging within me, and all I needed was a name, a look, a spark. I just didn't know it would come carrying scars and a uniform. They said I was made of obedience and good manners, as if my existence had been shaped in the shadow of the word Amen. From a young age, I was trained to lower my eyes, cross my hands in my lap, and smile gently, even when everything inside me screamed. My name is Merian Grace Holloway, daughter of Pastor Elias, the girl born in the front pew of the church and raised among verses and veils. The town called me the pastor's daughter, with that forced air of holiness, as if it were a title, but it felt more like a sentence. My clothes were long, my steps short, and my desires constantly erased in the name of virtue. I grew up hearing that purity was all a woman had, that love was a gift reserved for after marriage, if it came at all, and that God punished restless hearts. But mine was born beating out of rhythm. There were days I'd wake in the middle of the night with a tight chest, feeling life slip through my fingers like fine sand. I secretly read forbidden romances, soldiers' letters published in newspapers, dreaming of cities with lights, men who didn't speak in sermons, and feelings that burned for real, not just from pulpits. There was no one to tell this to, because here in this corner of southern Georgia, a woman who feels too much is seen as a danger. And I learned early that to survive, I had to stay quiet. But no matter how much you silence yourself, the world finds you eventually, sometimes in the form of an event, sometimes a glance. In my case, it came in worn boots, marked eyes, and a silence heavy with things unsaid. And in that instant, even without knowing his name, I understood that the world out there had just invaded mine. He appeared on an afternoon when the sky threatened rain and the whole town retreated as if the wind carried something impure. I was helping on the back porch of the church, folding towels for Sunday service, when I heard dragging footsteps and a muffled cough from the side gate. Strangers weren't common here, especially not men from outside. When I looked up, there he was, a tall, thin man with a crumpled uniform, unshaven, his shoulders bearing more weight than any military pack. There was no arrogance in him. On the contrary, there was a kind of silence that seemed to apologize for existing. One arm was bandaged, the other held a piece of paper that I later learned was a medical referral. My eyes lingered too long on his. Not because they were beautiful, though they were, but because they were tired in a way I recognized, tired like mine. He looked at me for a long, unguarded second. No words, no introduction. And that's how we recognized each other. Not as names, but as emptiness crossing paths. My father stepped out of the house at that moment with his usual authority and quickly took control, called the soldier brother, and ordered someone to take him to the back to rest. But before he disappeared from sight, he turned his face towards me once more, and I felt, with the clarity only instinct provides, that something inside me had been touched, not grandly or dramatically, just a gesture, a shared silence. But it was enough to make me realize that, for the first time, my faith was starting to bend before something stronger than fear. In the days that followed, I learned little about him, only that his name was Thomas Everett. He'd come from the north, and he was recovering from a shoulder wound after an explosion in the field. The army had sent him to our town because it was quiet enough for convalescence. But there was something in Thomas that seemed wounded far beyond the flesh. He was the kind of man who spoke little, ate slowly, and seemed to weigh every gesture as if calculating how much he could exist without taking up too much space. The parsonage where he stayed was behind the church, and it didn't take long for our paths to cross more often. At first casually, then with that deliberate strangeness two strangers share when they feel something they shouldn't. On the third morning, I went to the greenhouse to gather herbs for my mother's tea, and found him sitting on the stone bench, holding a dark notebook. I thought about turning away, but he spoke first, his voice hoarse and calm. "Do you believe in fate?" The question came out of nowhere, without context, as if we were already mid-conversation we'd never started. I took a moment to answer, not because I didn't know what to say, but because that was a question that, for me, had always been dangerous. I believe some things are meant to happen at a certain time, even if we try to run from them. He smiled. It was a short, almost pained smile, like someone unused to words that didn't come from orders or pleas. I thought I died out there, in the field, but now I'm here, in a place that feels too calm for the guilt I carry. That's when I understood that Thomas Everett wasn't just a wounded soldier. He was a man who'd seen the end of the world and returned with pieces missing. And there was something in me, maybe the part that always sought meaning in silences, that felt drawn to him. Our encounters became discreetly frequent. He'd help me carry water buckets, hold the dakwa for me, or just watch from a distance as I arranged the pews in the church. But it was in the details that we truly began to talk. In long looks, short questions, absences that said more than presence. My father started to notice, not with words, but with that vigilance only religious men seem to master. His sermons grew sharper, his prayers longer. One Sunday, he spoke about women with wavering hearts and eyes that stray from God's path. I knew it was for me, but what he didn't know was that I no longer felt like I was straying. I felt for the first time like I was following something from within, something that burned without hurting me. On a stifling afternoon, Thomas handed me a small envelope, folded 3 times, and said only, "If you want to understand, read it." I waited until everyone was asleep and opened it sitting on my bedroom floor, window open, heart pounding louder than the crickets outside. He wrote about fear, about blood, about the things he'd seen and the voices he still heard when he closed his eyes. He said he didn't deserve peace, but for the first time, looking at me, he felt that maybe, just maybe, there was still a place where his soul could rest. I folded the letter with trembling hands and cried silently. Not from pain, but from recognition. Because I carried guilt too. I carried fear too. I too felt unworthy of love after so long believing. It was something to be earned, not felt. That night, I understood there were wars greater than those of men, and that we, he and I, were fighting for something far more fragile than survival. We were fighting for permission. Permission to feel, permission to exist beyond imposed rules, permission to be just us. Over time, we began to live through gestures. He'd leave me wilted flowers picked from the roadside, notes tucked into the pages of the hymnal I used, at morning prayers, fragments of himself that seemed too small for the world, but to me carried the weight of a confession. In return, I offered what I could: listening, presence, eyes that didn't judge him as a hero or a sinner, just as a man. And maybe that's what kept him here, even after he was healed enough to leave. The town said he still needed rest, but I knew what he sought wasn't rest for his body. It was refuge for what remained inside. People started talking, first in hushed tones, then in bolder whispers. A girl too unmarried, a soldier not returning to the field, a look that lingered. Too long, my mother, always quiet, began walking with her eyes lower than usual. My father, on the other hand, raised his voice at dinners, slammed the Bible on the table, as if he could bury any rumors with it. He spoke of purity, with his eyes fixed on me, and I answered with the same silence of someone carrying a secret in their bones. One afternoon, when the heat mingled with the smell of dust and dry earth, Thomas waited for me in the orchard behind the church. I'd never gone there with him before, but that day I did. I went because there was no turning back, because every step I took toward him was both a risk and a liberation. When I reached him, he didn't say anything at first. He just held out his hand, and I took it. It was the first touch. Nothing in the world had prepared us for it, and yet it felt like the most natural thing that had ever happened. There was no lustful desire, no urgency, just that gentle strength of someone who'd found what they'd waited a lifetime for, and now, by a delicate miracle, it was there. "Aren't you afraid?" he whispered, and I answered without hesitation. "Every day, but with you, it's different. With you, even fear feels bearable." That night I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of my bed, knees together, eyes lost in the darkness, still feeling his hand entwined with mine, knowing everything could collapse at any moment. But for the first time I didn't wish to flee the town. For the first time I felt that maybe I didn't need to escape. Maybe it was enough to exist here, even amidst the fire, because now I wasn't alone anymore. And then came Sunday. The morning service was packed. My father took the pulpit with a look I knew well, stern, unrelenting, heavy with something beyond faith. There was disillusionment in his stance and a thirst for punishment. And when he began speaking about daughters who betray the home, I knew the veil had fallen. He knew. He'd heard, or someone had told him. It didn't matter. His anger was real, and now it was before the entire congregation. Thomas wasn't there. He'd been called the day before for an official summons. He'd left without warning, maybe without a choice, or maybe to protect me. The truth is, he was gone, and I stayed. I stayed with my eyes fixed on my father's face as he tore me apart, with words of salvation. And still, inside I didn't feel guilt, I felt absence, a silence that didn't hurt like before, but pulsed like a promise. That day, I understood. True love doesn't stop you from falling. It teaches you to fall standing. Time didn't flow. It dragged. After Thomas left, the town returned to its usual rhythm. But something in me had stopped. There were no letters, no news, no promises left behind. Just an emptiness where a man who saw me once stood. My days became outwardly routine, but inside, I was at war. While the church preached repentance, I discovered alone what forgiveness was, and it started with myself. My father didn't lash out at me with harsh words again, not because he forgave me, but because he realized I no longer listened with the same submission. A new silence grew between us. He watched me like someone trying to understand what he could no longer control. My mother went about her chores with more weight in her body and less light in her eyes, as if she knew something had broken in the house. and that it might be irreparable. But I bloomed, even among the ruins. I walked through town with firmer steps, read newspapers aloud in the public library, began teaching children to write, as if trying to build with letters what I could never say at home. Slowly, I felt my faith hadn't died. It had just changed direction. I no longer bowed to fear, but to love. That love which, in so little time, taught me the heart isn't a sin. 2 winters passed. 2 silent Christmases. 2 birthdays with a piece of cake and a memory. Thomas vanished from the world, like so many soldiers who left. And I prepared myself, day by day, for the possibility of never seeing him again. I allowed myself to imagine other paths, other faces, other stories. But no gesture from another man could fit into that place in me he'd touched, without asking, without promising, without destroying. Then came the telegram. It arrived on a mild spring afternoon, delivered by a breathless boy. My fingers shook before opening it, and for a moment I thought it was a late notice of mourning. But no. 3 lines, 3 sentences, enough to steal my breath, alive, free, coming back to where my heart stayed. Thomas. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just closed my eyes and felt as if hearing my name whispered for the first time after so long in silence. He arrived at the end of that week, not at the church or the main square, but at the greenhouse among the leaves that once sheltered us. He was thinner, his hair slightly gray, with the same tired eyes, but now there was peace there. And when he saw me, he didn't ask if I'd still been waiting. He knew, and I didn't ask where he'd been, because now all that mattered was the present. We sat together like before, for long, full minutes, with no need to say what was already sealed. The world outside was still a harsh place. The town still whispered, the church still judged, but we were at peace. Because in that moment, I understood, not every love is born to be accepted, but those that survive time, fear, and absence, those deserve to be lived, even if the cost is everything the world expects of us. The years passed, like the wind whispering through the trees when no one's watching. Calm, persistent, inevitable. Thomas and I built a simple life, far from the center, far from the eyes, that once condemned us for daring to feel. We never asked permission, and maybe that's why it was also ours. Many still saw us with suspicion. Others pretended not to see. My father aged in silence and passed with rigid hands clutching the Bible and eyes fixed on something perhaps only he understood. There was no formal reconciliation between us, but there was a kind of truce, a silent acknowledgement that his faith and mine no longer walked the same path, but both, somehow, still sought light. Thomas rarely spoke about what he'd lived through in the war after he returned, but there were nights he'd wake sweating, eyes wide, heart racing. In those moments, I just press my forehead to his and say, "You're here." That was enough. We had a daughter. Her name is Clara. I chose it not for someone I knew, but for what she brought to our lives, clarity. She grew up among books, plans, and questions we never feared answering. I never taught her to stay quiet, and it was in hearing her laughter that I realized one day we were finally free. Today, with my white hair and time-stained fingers, I write these words without regret. Because if I'd chosen the easy path, the approved one, I might have had a life without scandal, but also without truth. And there's no greater pain than living a story that isn't yours. The love I found in Thomas wasn't made of promises. It was made of presence. It was a love without crowns, without altars, without guarantees, but with roots, And even if the world doesn't celebrate us like the romances I read secretly as a teenager, I know what we had, and that's enough. If someone ever finds these pages, I hope they understand. Faith doesn't need to imprison. Love doesn't need to be perfect. And courage sometimes begins with a look. Merian.